Okay, thanks. Hi, James, and welcome to this interview.
Hi, Mark. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and really thank you for doing this. So I think very much appreciate your generosity in giving this. I suppose where I want to start is just to ask you a little bit about you, really, where you're up to, where you're from. Perhaps.
Oh, right, okay.
You know, I mean, we're going to be talking about your book, Contextual Transactional Analysis, and I thought actually it'd probably be good to have a bit of context about you to start with.
A bit of context, sure. I mean, that's a fair question. So I've worked as a therapist now for about 11 years, having qualified originally in psychodynamic counselling and then gone on to train as a CBT therapist. And I completed my TA training I think about 5 or 6 years ago now. So I've been a CTA for 5 or 6 years. So I've been a clinician for that time. And over the last 5 years, I've split my time as a clinician in the English National Health Service with a role as a senior lecturer in integrative counselling and psychotherapy at a small university called Newman University, which is in Birmingham in the middle of England, which actually inspired, well, it was really where a lot of the ideas for the book were generated, working with people in sort of the communities that I've been involved with for, you know, the best part of a decade now.
Yeah. Lovely, lovely. And can you say a bit about, you know, where did you first come across TA? What drew you to it?
Oh, that's a really good question. My very first job was in Nottingham. I worked for the English National Health Service in Nottingham. And my supervisor in the service had done some TA training. He hadn't completed it, but he was a nurse practitioner and he'd done a couple of years of TA training at the Burn Institute, where I eventually went on and completed my own TA training. And he was a very good supervisor. He was one of those people who seemed to be able to work out exactly what was going on with people and sort of exactly what they needed without appearing to do very much. So although I'd encountered the ideas before, you know, because most people have encountered TA ideas at some point in their training, he made them look very clinically persuasive. Mm-hmm. So I became very interested in learning, I suppose, what he seemed to be able to do. Mm-hmm. So I made what, in hindsight, was probably the slightly foolish decision to do both CBT training and TA training at the same time. So the first year of my TA training was I was doing 2 sort of, you know, master's level trainings at the same time. Don't try this at home, kids, really. But I seemed to get through it. So that was really my first exposure to TA was there.
Yeah, I'm glad you did. I mean, you know, in culminating with this, you know, with your book, really glad that you've kept in there and completed that. You know, and I was also wondering about, perhaps you could say about who within the TA world has inspired you in terms of ideas or
well, that's actually a really interesting question, Mark, because this may not be obvious for people who've read the book. And it sort of almost isn't obvious to me now after all this time of having allowed these ideas to ferment in my head. But the project actually started out as a kind of an attempt to evolve cathexis theory. So I had, when I was in the early stages of my training, I was a sessional therapist at the now sadly defunct Connect Therapeutic Community in Birmingham, which, as some people will know, was one of the last remaining cathexis communities around the world. So I was quite interested in the approach at the time for clinical reasons. And I've always loved the cathexis reader. I mean, it's a very tightly integrated theory. It's 80% genius and 20% madness, or maybe the ratio changes. It depends on, you know, the ratio shifts a little bit each time I read it. But there were certain ideas in there that I was really, really interested in and quite compelled by. And although it may not be obvious to the reader, some of them, particularly the view of the parent as being the aspect of the self that defines reality, which is, you know, I thought, wow, that's, I mean, that's kind of a slightly crazy thing to say, but it's also a really provocative thing to say the parent defines reality, because then if the parent defines reality, you never truly step out from under the shadow of the parent. So for me, cathexis was kind of quite a natural starting point for my own thinking, because I was very interested in the parent and what I was noticing in my own clinical work, and how I was struggling, I suppose, to make sense of it in terms of a way of thinking about my own practice. You know, I think of the cathexis model, and also maybe the radical psychiatry one, that have said perhaps the most about the parent ego state outside of Burns' original contributions, whereas some other models have perhaps been more drawn to expanding on the notion of the child ego state. So I was very interested in what would happen if, you know, we took the mature psychological structure, you know, the P2, the A2, and the C2 seriously, and thought about expanding it in that direction.
Fascinating, really interesting, and actually, having read your book, I can see the connections there between what you're saying about the cathexis school and your own writing, particularly around the parent ego state. I wondered if you could say something about what the sort of key ideas within the book are, from your perspective, or, you know, perhaps give us a little summary of what the main ideas in the book.
So the core idea, and I think it's important to say at this point that the book is intended as a kind of continuous argument. It's a continuous argument that attempts to revise really certain very key aspects of the whole transactional analysis edifice in an attempt to solve certain kinds of difficulties that are perhaps better understood as psychosocial rather than psychological, and which I felt perhaps hadn't been properly understood or worked through in the existing literature. So having started from that point that there was something about the social and our connection to the social, our emergent connection to the social, that was not properly explained by our existing models, I had to kind of rework my way through the theory, looking at the key concepts, finding where the gaps and the cracks and the slight omissions or contradictions were, and trying to work out what I could do with these ideas that we know and love in a way that made them work to try and solve this particular problem. So each chapter in the book really is an attempt to kind of rework a particular piece, either of theory or of practice, in an attempt to provide an overall comprehensive framework for understanding these particular difficulties.
Yeah, interesting. And I was thinking, you know, I was really noticing that is like something about, you know, there was, I wondered if you could say a little bit more about some of the areas where you felt we needed to rework some of our ideas, particularly to encompass that psychosocial side.
Yeah, well, I think we've already talked a little bit about the parent, and I suppose that was the starting point, really, because I mean, I remember even in my time when I was at the Burn completing my training, you know, having conversations with my fellow trainees about, you know, well, like the parent's kind of 80% there, but there's like, you know, again, there's this 20% gap where I'm just not quite sure that the theory works, or I'm not quite sure what it's saying. And so, you know, when you get something that seems to be mostly correct, but not entirely correct, I think the tendency is to try and soldier on with it and ignore the contradictions or gaps. And I'm not that kind of person. So if I see a contradiction or a gap, I'm like a, you know, rat down a drain pipe. I really want to find something out about it. And I went through this very interesting experience of kind of starting to kind of unpick the theory. You know, it's a bit like getting 85% the way through a crossword, and you've done really well, and then you suddenly find you can't answer something. It's like, oh no. And then, of course, what do you do when you get to that point? You have to work your way back through the answers. And it was almost like I worked my way back through all the answers about the parent ego state, to really think about what it would mean to say that, you know, it's rather different than I think the parent ego state that is represented in Burns' writings. And I think I also came to a conclusion it was perhaps slightly different in the way that, say, for example, someone like Richard Erskine, who's done some really important work on the parent ego state, but quite different from mine, represents it. Because what I wasn't seeing, and still am not generally seeing that often, sometimes but not consistently, was the kind of very discrete changes that Burn observed, where somebody almost shifts physically, phenomenologically, and they almost become like a ventriloquist dummy, and they sort of mouth a parent voice in this way. I just wasn't seeing those kind of sharp internal clicks between states that I think the original TA theory was really proposing. nor was I necessarily seeing the kind of internal sense that there was something rather separate inside me that needed to be absorbed. What I was actually seeing in my clients was, because I worked within particular geographical regions, I was seeing something that was more a collective way of seeing things that became fairly obvious when you saw a lot of clients from the same place. There were certain ways of seeing things that kind of came through quite strongly, but they were sort of blended, really. So it wasn't quite clear where the adult ended and the parent began in that way. So the starting point for my rethinking was, okay, well, how do we think about the parent if we can no longer think about it as being so sharply delineated in that clear internal and externally structured way from our adult ego state? And from that point, I then went through a number of kind of revisions about thinking, okay, well, what is the relation? What is the nature of the parent, and what is its relationship in particular to the adult, through a series of particular questions that I asked about it.
Okay. I've just sort of got one eye on the chat as we're talking. I've seen a comment from Karen Minikin saying she wasn't aware that you were explicit in acknowledging the cathexis reader, and also radical psychiatry is more about adult in her view. What do you want to say about that?
Well, I suppose both of the approaches aim as therapeutic approaches to raise the profile of the adult, but perhaps they find the source of the injury more in the parent, you might say. So that would be how I would talk about it, but they tend to use the parent much more as a way of talking about the outside world, rather than just the actual parent. So I agree that both approaches are very interested in raising autonomy, but they have a sense that the parent is quite an important way of understanding, certainly in my understanding of the models, how things have gone wrong for that person.
Okay, lovely, thank you. I mean, I've got a number of questions that are in the chat. If you're all right, I'm just going to feed you some of these at the moment, and then we'll.
Okay, sure.
Somebody, and again, I think this comes from Karen. There's something about, at one point in the book, you talk about initially thinking horizontal problems were not relevant for everyone, but you changed your mind. Could you say more about that?
Okay, well, in order to answer Karen's question, I'd probably better say what horizontal problems are for the benefit of those who haven't read the book. Idea. So I talked a couple of questions ago about the fact that I said there was a specific kind of set of psychosocial difficulties that I felt were not catered for really by our existing models. And so I came up with this notion of a horizontal problem, which contrasts obviously with a vertical problem. So vertical problems are our problems as usual as we think of them with our regular models. They tend to be consistent dispositions to think, feel, and act in certain ways that are consistent across time and quite often developmentally rooted. But horizontal problems lie kind of across the self and the world together, and they are more about deficits in what the world makes available to us or intentionally withholds. So it works on the assumption that in order for us to be autonomous, well-functioning human beings, certain environmental conditions need to be in place. And that if those things are not in place, some of our capacity to be autonomous and act autonomously will simply not come through or will break down. So it's a difficulty that is experienced psychologically, but is perhaps better understood as being caused psychosocially. So that was really how my thinking about horizontal problems. So Karen's question was, how did I come to think about them as having?
You originally said that they were not relevant for everyone, but changed your mind.
Well, it is true that there are many people that we will see who won't have horizontal difficulties. It's not intended to be a comprehensive theory. It's intended to be a theory to address a certain kind of difficulty. But the clients that I was working with at the time that I produced these ideas were largely people from very poor inner city areas in the Midlands of the United Kingdom. And I did wonder whether this was simply limited to the kinds of experiences that we might see in those communities. And I suppose then once I took the ideas out of that community, I sort of felt that actually there could be breakdowns in the social structure, even in relatively seemingly affluent contexts, or quite sort of politically empowered contexts that might also have some of these features as well. I don't think they're as common, but I certainly think, I mean, you know, if there is anything that the last, you know, 2 or 3 years of the world in the West has taught us, is that, you know, we're not immune as a society from going slightly crazy at a sort of a social and political level. So it struck me that there could be significant difficulties in the way that horizontal problems describe at a cultural level. Even where those cultures were kind of either majority cultures or quite affluent cultures, there were still breakdowns that could occur. So the book does attempt to describe some of those difficulties.
Lovely. Yeah, lovely. Okay, I'm still going to stay with just work a bit more. Again, Karen asks about, could you say a little bit more about skeptical liberalism in light of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter this summer?
Well, again, I'd have to introduce a little bit more about the ideas.
Which is fine, James, absolutely fine. I think that's part of what we want to hear, is the ideas that you are expanding within this book.
So I'm going to start a little way back down the line before I come to Karen's question to explain why that chapter was necessary in the book, because it may not be immediately obvious. Within our professional literature, and I don't just mean transactional analysis literature, I mean psychotherapy and counseling literature generally, we're much more interested in culture and identity, social identity, in ways that perhaps we haven't been historically. And there's a fairly large body of emergent literature around this, which is coming through. My feeling, having encountered this literature in many different places, both in my clinical and my teaching capacity, is that there are certain kind of assumptions which are fairly prevalent across this literature, which when you took them in total, suggested that the profession that we're in other words, the talking therapist profession, had a fairly consistent sort of political and social position on a number of issues. And that position I referred to as liberal skepticism, which is a neologism. It's a term that I coined on my own. I was half tempted to borrow the philosopher Richard Rorty's term, postmodern bourgeois liberalism, but I felt that might be a little bit provocative, so I stayed away from it. So there are a couple of few sub-positions within liberal skepticism. So one of which is the postmodern insistence on there being no absolute truth, or the disintegration of grand narratives. The second aspect being that you know, the reason that some narratives rise to the fore rather than others tends to be due to questions of power rather than due to questions of legitimacy. And the third aspect of liberal skepticism is that you know, pluralism is generally a good thing. So I found each of those assumptions in its own way to be slightly problematic. And the reason that I felt I had to address it, even though it seemed a very, very long way from our clinical concerns, was if you go into the kinds of communities that I work in, and you work on the assumption that all forms of culture are good, and you work on the assumption that there are all sorts of different kinds of truth, it's very, very difficult to account for forms of oppression, because if a culture is genuinely oppressed, then it is in some ways, as far as I can see, it has been deformed by oppression. So if you're saying that all forms of culture are good, there is no difference between an oppressed and a non-oppressed culture. So pluralism for me has to be questioned on that level. That doesn't mean there aren't many different forms of the good, but it does mean that not every single variation on a culture is good. It also struck me that to get rid of the notion of truth, or the notion of progress in belief, would really leave communities that hadn't had a chance to really know and establish who they were stuck. Nor would, and more to the point, it would undercut their capacity to speak and persuade others on the basis of a common understanding of something. So my sense is that people who adopt a liberal skeptical position feel that all one has to do is kind of tear things down and attack things, and then we leave a kind of a benign pluralism in place. And I simply didn't think that was going to work for the kinds of people that I was working with, who I felt needed the notion of a truthful stance and needed to be able to use that notion of truth to persuade people. So can you just reread Karen's question for me again, just to make sure that I'm...
Hold on, let me go back. I've gone on a bit. So let me bear with me a second.
That's okay.
Here we go. So it was to say more about skeptical liberalism in light of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter this summer.
Oh gosh.
So
okay.
there's two parts. So I think you've set the scene a bit there, James.
Yeah, I mean, how much these ideas have to say about specific political events. I'm not quite sure it was intended to designate a general political ethos within our position. I certainly think, like most people, I've been affected by what's been happening in the world over the last 3 or 4 years, and how could one not be? I don't think it's pure media hubbub that things are very different than how I thought they would be 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So I certainly think there was something about a kind of a disintegration in what you might call a public sphere, or our ability to have conversations with people who were not like us, that I found very troubling. That it seemed as though our entire public discourse was about shrieking at each other and blaming each other, and really finding grounds to identify yet further divisions between ourselves. So quite what that has to say about the specific phenomenon that Karen's asking about, I'm not quite sure. But I certainly, in terms of my sense of how we've responded to COVID, I think, I mean, this is, I'm not an expert in this. I don't know more than anybody else does on this call. But certainly my sense was that I've met a lot of people who just simply didn't really believe that COVID existed or was a problem. And I found that because their trust in other people and in what they're told, and the notion of a kind of what you might call an informational ecosystem, a life world of information, ideas and experiences that we all draw upon to enhance and extend ourselves had started really to disappear. And I found that very, very troubling.
Thank you. I mean, I guess it's an interesting book, isn't it? Because you've written a book about context, and of course, some of the context of what's gone on over the last year is we've seen some really significant things happening. I also, thinking about those events that Karen's mentioning, but also we could think about Brexit as well, about what's gone on in the States with Trump, etc.
Yeah, and I suppose we do need the sense of a shared ability to kind of converge, which I think the notion of truthfulness can support. I mean, so if you imagine that you had a community that suffered enormous historical oppression, like African Americans have in the United States, and you kind of attempt to address that through a kind of what I've called liberal skepticism, what you can actually end up with, quite simply, is one community saying, well, you're racist and owe us a historical debt, because that's the belief in our world. And you can have other people going, well, actually, in our world, racism isn't that important. And you've got no ability for one world to hold the other to account if there is no kind of common standard of truth. So I think that pluralism can actually, in some ways, be a way of people escaping a kind of a collective responsibility in that way. And that was my concern about it, really.
I'm gonna move. So I'm gonna offer you some questions from some other people at this point. Jim Davis asks, what is your take on Pearl Drago's idea of cultural parent and how it accounts for the self in the world individual?
Oh God, do I have to answer that honestly? I probably do, don't I? I'm not. I really wasn't persuaded in any way, shape or form by the idea that subdividing parent ego states into kind of what I'd call content, character and etiquette. I just didn't see that it really enhanced our understanding of what was going on at all. I think, it struck me as an overextension of the parent adult child model to keep just subdividing everything into three and thinking that you're doing something a bit meaningful. Perhaps I'm being wrong or perhaps I'm being unfair, but when I looked at the ideas, I couldn't see anything in them really that allowed me to make sense of the things that I was trying to explain in this book. And I'm not really quite sure what it adds to our understanding of culture or the social.
Okay. Okay. Interesting.
Though other opinions are available, I appreciate that.
And you may get some opinions in the chat room, which is fine. It's absolutely. And we may come back to it. And Alistair Moody says, are you referring to the cultural environment of family community, like the water we are swimming in?
Okay, that's really good. I don't know whether Alistair's actually read the book, because I do use sort of water metaphors in one of the chapters. So I mean, and I work through this in quite a lot of detail. I contrast the notion of the relationship of the self to the world as being like a fish in water. In other words, the fish is always in the water, and it's kind of the environment in which the fish swims. So I say, yes, that's very persuasive in some ways, but it still identifies the fish as a kind of very discrete phenomenon that you can kind of take out of the water and study in particular ways. So the metaphor that I preferred was the distinction between the ocean and the wave. So a wave is emergent. A wave is both a distinct thing in its own right, but also at the same time never ever fully separates from the environment. So I felt that was actually a more persuasive metaphor than the notion of fish and water, because in principle a fish is a very discrete object, and I wanted to get that sense really that our minds, I mean, yes, clearly we are distinct entities. We are distinct entities in a bodily sense, in the same way that a fish is a distinct entity in a bodily sense. But if you think about the notion of our minds, how many of our thoughts are really ours or ours alone? How much of our knowledge is shared, or so those kind of questions were ones that I was really, really interested in. And I felt the notion of a wave, identity as emergent rather than submerged, might be a good way of thinking about it. It's a book which really takes that notion of emergence quite seriously.
Okay. You've certainly stirred up some interest in the chat room, James. I've got quite a few questions. I've got another one from Karen here, actually, and she was, how do you think about objective and subjective truth? The subject experience, for example, of an oppressed black man or a woman may be completely alienated from someone like Mr. T. I'm assuming you're referring to Mr. Trump there, Karen, who would have a very different version of what is true. Interested in your thinking, as you've thought a great deal about these things philosophically.
I'm not sure. I mean, subjective and objective are terms that we could spend a great deal of time thinking about. I guess, I mean, there are things that are subjective to a human being, which can't really be shared. But I'm not quite sure that I understand what the notion of subjective truth might mean. If it's just true for me, I'm not quite sure what the word truth is doing in that sentence. If truth doesn't say that something is kind of persuasive or generally agreed upon, I don't quite know what the word would be doing in a sentence like that. So I'm very interested in those notions of under what conditions can our accounts of the world converge, and at what point do they not converge? At what point would we say, we really don't see there's any other reason but to see things one way? And there are occasions where we might see that, and there are also certain occasions where complete convergence is not possible and a plurality of viewpoints seem to be recognizable. To go back to Karen's question, I'm not quite sure what part the notion of a subjective truth of somebody would play if it were not something that they could use to interact with the world in a different way, or use to persuade somebody, or use to recount their experience in a way that was persuasive to somebody else, so that they might engage in an act of persuasion or convergence or agreement with somebody. To me, questions of truth are only really interesting in those contexts.
As you're talking, I'm just thinking about having read the book. I was thinking about I wonder whether you could expand a bit more on the idea of pragmatism, which you refer to in the book.
Yes.
as a sort of underpinning for your approach in many ways, if that makes sense. Correct me
Yes,
if I'm wrong.
it does. Yeah, I mean, interestingly, yeah, it does. It informs a lot of my ideas in a lot of ways, and increasingly, even since the publication of the book, I've become even more interested in certain aspects of it that I hadn't really encountered before. I suppose if you're going to address a particular set of ideas like postmodernism in a critical way, I think you have an obligation both to honor what seems to be useful about those ideas. And these ideas haven't hung around for no reason. They've hung around because people have found something useful in them. So you have to try and honor what is useful in those ideas at the same time as offering something that replaces it, whilst also at the same time supposedly making good on correcting them, what I take to be their mistakes. So pragmatism, which is for those who don't know, is a fairly broad, disharmonious school of philosophy that sort of emerged towards the tail end of the 19th century and was led mainly by Charles Peirce, William James, of course, was also a very eminent psychologist, and John Dewey, and has had several successors and a recent revival under the auspices of Richard Rorty in the 70s and 80s, which is still fairly current. What pragmatism enabled us to do, for me, really was first of all, to take that notion of the social seriously, that that there is something about our notion of truth or accountability that is inherently social, that we are sort of accountable to each other and we make use of each other's ideas. And it also talked quite a lot about the social pursuit of truth and linked that much more to kind of questions of social democratic forms. So you're thinking about under what conditions might people come to reach better ideas about themselves and the world, which I think is a very key question within the book, which I think pragmatism addresses quite a lot. But what pragmatism does do is it also, at the same time as being quite optimistic about the notion of progress in our ideas, it gets rid of a correspondence notion of truth. Now, what a correspondence notion of truth means is there is a world out there and it is the obligation of our minds to kind of mirror it. So pragmatism replaces that really with a notion of kind of progress towards something upon which nobody would disagree. I mean, that's putting it very, very bluntly. But it really introduced that idea that, we're never quite sure that we've got there. We just are sure that there are points at which our conversation comes to an end because there is nothing more to say. And that seemed to kind of bring in a note of humility that pragmatism does introduce. Peirce called it fallibilism, which is that we're never quite sure we've penetrated the veil of the world, but we can at some point be sure that our conversation comes to an end because there is nothing more to say about something. And that really seemed to kind of bring in the sort of the humility that I think postmodernism can usefully introduce us to, that we can and sometimes should challenge things, whilst at the same time reminding us of our obligation to make progress towards things. It was quite an important part of the philosophical undergirding of what I was doing in the book.
Okay. Alistair says, in popular discourse, beliefs often seem to trump the facts. Is it helpful to think about competing frames of reference? And I know you write about frames of reference in your book. So would you like to say a bit about that?
Is it more useful to talk about beliefs than...
Fact. He says, in popular discourse, beliefs often seem to trump the facts. Is it helpful to think about competing frames of reference?
Well, I mean, I think facts sometimes play a part. I mean, facts on the whole, perhaps don't have that much to do with the kind of work that we do in therapy. I mean, we're more interested in, there are facts do come into it, but they're very rarely decisive in therapy. Part of the action of any kind of therapy is really much more around values and beliefs, which of course are much harder to pin down in that way. I suppose that the way of thinking about Alistair's question would be to think about under what terms might we think of competition as taking place, and what would be the point of competition, and is there learning or persuasion that takes place between people who are in competition? Because I would not want to think of frames of reference as things that were always equally as good as each other or never subject to revision. I think it's a really important part of any kind of frame of reference that, yes, there may sometimes be competition between things, and sometimes there may be irreconcilable points of difference, but very often there isn't. Very often there is scope for improvement. And I think, if we're going to be therapists and work with people who haven't really had an opportunity to know themselves or to think about themselves properly, we have to have that notion of progress in place.
Lovely, thank you. I'm going to go back to an earlier question, actually, that Karen put in the chat room that I didn't pick up then, but I thought I would leave till later. And what it was concerning your clinical practice, James, and really how writing of this book and the development of your ideas have changed your clinical practice.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, there is a chapter in the work on clinical practice, and I wrote it with reservations because it almost felt as though I needed to write two books. I needed to certain things that it would be useful for you to understand in order to become the version of yourself that you could always be. You can't always look within to know those things, which of course is the traditional therapy pathway. You know, our traditional therapy pathways are around understanding and acceptance of the self. Well, I think one of the assumptions of contextual practice is that sometimes we understand ourselves better by understanding the world better, because we then understand ourselves as part of the world. So we begin to understand ourselves as social creatures, as citizens, as participants in democracy, and we begin to have a sense of how things fit together around us. And as we have a sense of how things fit together around us, our sense of ourselves might change. But what I'm sure I came across, and I'm sure most people would agree with, is that you can't at the same time turn therapy into a lecture because most people haven't come for that, and they tend to glaze over quite quickly. So there was that sense of, really, how did you engage in those dialogues in a way that was both respectful and also at the same time quite productive? So there are a number of different alterations that has to take place in order to do that. And I'm by no means saying that I've got all the answers to all those questions worked out, because my own practice is evolving as it should, in the light of the clinical experience I'm now undertaking. But I do hope perhaps to return to some of those questions in the fullness of time to think about, how might we include certain ideas or certain ways of thinking about things within therapy, or at least think about a bridge between therapy and what you might call certain kinds of learning. But I think, and I don't think that bridge is really there at the moment so much. It's maybe there in some of the critical therapies in a quite dogmatic form, but I'm not necessarily in the form that I was hoping to aim at.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Jim says when you use the word correcting a point of view, it seems to me that this seems to suggest, something else popped up, that this seems to suggest there is an objective truth. So I wonder if you just want to say something about that.
Well, I think what pragmatism attempts to do is to replace the notion of a correspondence version of truth, which is that, that we can only, this is a complex idea, and it's really difficult to summarize without telling somebody to go away and read a lot of books. But it attempts to replace the correspondence notion of truth with the notion of truth as kind of consensus, I guess you would say. So it thinks of truth as being internal to kind of conversations that we might have between ourselves. That we all know what we say when we say this, and the world sort of prompts changes in our conversation. So Peirce was very keen to say that we don't necessarily pierce the veil of the world in that way. But if you take, just a very simple example that I use in the book, if you have a client who's going to jump out of a 9-story window, You know, I mean, are you going to accept plural definitions of what's going to happen when they jump out of that 9-story window? I suspect you're not. Now, you don't have to have a story about that says, you know, that I'm in contact with reality to say that that person is going to plunge to the ground and do themselves serious injury. But you can say, as the pragmatists say, well, I've reached a set of ideas that no person who is engaging in this conversation honestly would disagree with. So it simply replaces that notion of correspondence with an objective reality with the notion of the end point of a conversation. It's just a different way of understanding what the truth process is. It's very interesting that we're getting a lot of questions about this. And again, this is partly what I was attempting to address in the liberal skepticism chapter. I sense that a lot of therapists think that there is something quite productive in aiming at pluralism because we're all trained. We're all trained to respect the client's point of view. And I work on a different set of assumptions. I work on the set of assumptions that we're all staggering around in the dark a lot of the time and that reaching the light is really, really hard. I actually think when I worked with my clients, I think the notion that everybody has their own form of truth is not a productive starting point. In fact, I think it risks sort of patronizing people to stay where they are if we say, well, this is your truth, rather than actually there might be a better way of seeing things. Because if you genuinely believe that there are better ways to see things, I think we have an obligation to create the conditions under which a person can evaluate that idea for themselves and perhaps change their mind as a result.
Good. And I suppose what I'm really mindful of, James, as I'm listening to you, is just, you know, your book was written as a sort of an ongoing discussion or sort of debate is the way I felt. And I certainly get that sense of the people in the audience really are wanting to engage in that debate with you. So
yeah, sure.
Which is great, I think. I've got a question here, something a little bit more specific. Let's see where you go with this. It says, how might you use your approach in a secondary school where the social culture in schools sees a rise in increasing numbers of students identifying as having anxiety, and use this as a reason why they can't do things?
Gosh, there's a lot in that one. Okay, so I mean, I do sort of touch on this in the final chapter of the book. And my answer to that, I guess, is slightly unusual in as much as I think of the profession and the edifice of therapy as also being part of the world. It's also part of the social. Therapy ideas are part of our social tapestry. They're not just things that we learn about on therapy courses, and they're not our exclusive province. So many of our clients have found out about our ideas without coming anywhere near a clinical session because they Google them, or because they read books, or because they go to self-help sites. So there is something about people being able to access these ideas at times where they are looking for explanations for something that allows people to make a certain kind of sense of their experience and to adopt a certain language to talk about them, which might be, you know, I'm anxious about this, or I have an anxiety disorder, or I'm struggling with anxiety. So we have sort of encouraged people at a social level to describe some of their experiences in terms of an illness role or in terms of an illness, rather than describing it in terms of, you know, either a natural developmental process which is causing you distress or a response to your environment. So I think that the question has picked up on something quite interesting, which is, you know, is it a useful starting point for somebody to come through the door and say, I've got an anxiety disorder, which, you know, is increasingly my experience of working with young people who have, you know, effectively scaffolded their own internal experience by going online and participating in forums and communities. And they come and their stories are bundles of symptoms. They say, I've got this and this and this and this and this and this. And I really, you know, in some ways it's very hard because you kind of think, well, actually, I know what you're saying to me, sort of, but I think there's probably a better way to say this. I think there's a better way to say why you're here. And actually trying to kind of take people back to a slightly different story, which encourages them to understand both their relationship to themselves outside of an illness role and also their relationship to the world around them, would actually be quite a useful thing to do.
Lovely, lovely. Okay, I've got one or two other questions that I want to ask, and I'll keep an eye on the chat room, see if anything else comes through. And Eunice, who posed that question, said, "Thank you." So,
well, thank you. I'm pleased my answer was useful. It's good to know.
So, I was wondering about where you see the direction of transactional analysis going from here onwards. What thoughts do you have about that?
Well, that's an interesting question to ask somebody who's a CTA but hasn't necessarily gone down the successor routes to that. I'm not a PTSTA, I'm not a TSTA, and I don't teach on a TA course. I teach on an integrative course. Increasingly, as a therapist, I think more in terms of good ideas rather than separate schools. And I don't think that's necessarily an alien concept to a lot of the people who practice as therapists. I mean, we all beg, borrow, and steal what seems to be useful to us. And as long as we do it in a disciplined and respectful way, I would encourage that. I wrote the book within the TA fold, and I could easily have written it outside of TA. I could easily have taken these ideas and written them outside of the model in a way that would work kind of transmodally, and may yet do that when I have the time, which isn't now. But I suppose I stuck with TA for this, not necessarily because I wanted to encourage the continued existence of lots and lots of separate schools of therapy, but because I felt, our terms actually were quite good starting points. I do still think there is something about multiple self states that is very persuasive as a way of understanding people. I do still think there is something about the notion of games that is very persuasive of a way of understanding certain kinds of interactions with people. I do think there is something about the notion of a parent ego state that is still, in a reformed way, somewhat useful as a way of understanding people. So I'm certainly not in favor of jettisoning the whole edifice of TA, but whether I necessarily fully support the notion of a wholly separate set of organizations and training programs in an ongoing way, I don't know. I'm ambivalent about that because I find being an integrative practitioner very liberating, because I don't have to say what I am. I just have to say what I do and what I believe. I don't have to go through the process of defining myself as an integration therapist. I mean, technically, yes, you do, but I sort of duck that question. I just cite my pragmatist answer, which is, well, if it works, and I can provide a justification for it in a conversation with my peers, then it's in. I find, I think as I progress as a practitioner, that's important to me. And I'm not just trained as a TA therapist. Yes. I have 3 practitioner level trainings. And, I want the option to change my mind. I'm sorry. I think it's important to reserve the option to change your mind in the light of new experiences. I have every confidence that TA will play an important part in my professional work on an ongoing basis, but who knows what's around the corner? I might change my mind to come up with better ideas. And I think that's very consistent with the philosophy of the book.
Yeah, lovely, James. Thank you very much. And it's quite, for me, it was quite refreshing to hear you saying about borrowing from different schools. I'd never really thought about it quite like that. But when you say it, I think, yeah, there's something in that, I think.
Well, we are a mongrel discipline. Transactional analysis is a mongrel discipline. I mean, we're bits of lots of different therapies that Byrne very ingeniously managed to join together, and generally quite persuasively joined together. But if you go back to the original source text, you can see the joins. I mean, you can see that the ideas were kind of cobbled together. And I think, all therapies, even if they are sort of pure blue blood therapies, are still integrations of different ideas. They're still borrowing ideas from all over the place. So there's nothing particularly new or distinctive about being a magpie. It's just that some of us are more honest about it than others.
Lovely. Thank you, James. I was just wondering, is there a question that I haven't asked you, or anybody in the chat room haven't asked you, that you would have really liked to have been asked in this interview?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think actually, interestingly, when the book went out to reviewers before I'd written it, the people who thought were going to tell me it was a good idea or not, somebody said, where's the child ego state in this? because you don't write very much about it. And it's true, I don't write very much about it. And I think you would usually expect it, particularly in a contemporary setting, that people talk more about it. So I guess I'm surprised that people didn't ask more about the absence of more content on the child ego state. And there is something on it in there. I talk about it really as just a form of living memory, really. It's you know, aspects of ourselves that we have been, which is very general, but I don't stick with a developmental sense of the child ego state. But I suppose if I were going to kind of answer that imaginary question, I might say that, you know, my ideas around it are still, I suppose, are still forming. I mean, I'm still open to trying to work out quite how that piece of the puzzle fits in. I mean, I didn't necessarily write the book at this time because my ideas were finished. I wrote the book at this time because otherwise I'd still have been sat there in 50 years' time tweaking it. So, you know, I've, like most things, you know, I mean, and this is true of Byrne as well, you know, he wrote and revised continuously. I mean, there are small revisions all the way through his writings. So the book isn't necessarily the end product of my own thinking or my own evolution as a therapist or a thinker or a person. And I hope perhaps to return to that question of the child ego state when I've had slightly more time to think about it, maybe.
Okay, lovely, James. Thank you very much. I don't really have anything else to ask. I just wonder if there are any final questions that anybody's got for James that they could pop into the chat room. We've just got a few minutes left. I'll give them a moment just for people to finish typing. I suppose, you know, it's been really interesting listening to you. Having read the book, one of the things that I was really aware of is it's quite a provocative book, I felt, for me, and challenging. But I also thought this is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing for us to be questioning some of our ideas in this way.
Yeah, I think it did have to make a certain kind of space for itself by, you know, sort of shoulder barging a couple of ideas slightly a couple of inches to the left just to make space for itself. But it's also, you know, it was intended to try and answer certain problems, you know, particularly about how we think about the social, you know, and you don't get anywhere just by criticizing ideas. You only get places by replacing them. It's really that simple, you know. Minds abhor a vacuum. If you just criticize people's ideas, they'll stay as they are. If you actually show them there's a slightly better way to do it, then they might just adopt your ideas. So I'm hoping that there's something about the nature of the social as an ongoing kind of constituent and essential support of the self throughout life, and socialization as a necessary means of making use of the social around us, which I think will be very useful, hopefully as a starting point for lots of different understandings about the relationship between the self and the world that many people are engaged in the project of trying to understand at the moment.
Thank you. So I've got a few questions for you. So one was Karen asked, do you think pluralism is having no discernment?
Well, there are versions. I mean, there are versions of pluralism where if you said everything is equally good, you would not be discriminating between different things. I mean, there's a line in the book, I think, which I cite from Jeffrey Stout, who's a pragmatist philosopher, where he said, you know, let 1,000 flowers bloom, but make sure we kill the weeds at the same time, which is really a way of saying, yes, there may be lots of equally good ways to see things, but not all ways of seeing things are equally good. So I don't think pluralism is necessarily non-discerning, because we might go through quite a tough interrogatory process and still conclude that process by deciding that there were a handful of equally worthwhile ways of seeing things. We just shouldn't presume that from the beginning.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. And so I think Anne says, do you see evidence of the child ego state in your clients?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I really do want to stress that the book I wrote was intended to account for certain aspects of human experience. It is not a comprehensive theory of how people are. It's intended to identify certain features about people and their experience that I felt were not catered for by other models. So it is quite intentionally and explicitly written as a supplementary approach rather than a standalone one. I do see the child ego state often in my clients, and I think that we have some very good ideas about those. You know, I don't need to tell people on the call what they are because I'm sure they've already read them. You know, those ideas inform my work greatly, and I don't think I could do my job without them. And I haven't said much about it because at the moment I think I haven't really got much to say which goes beyond those ideas. I'm very respectful of that contribution, and I'm very grateful to the people who did it, that they took the time to produce those ideas.
Yeah, lovely. Okay, so we started off asking you about you and where you came from. So I'm going to bring it back to you, James.
Okay.
This is Karen says, she said she could ask more, but probably enough from her. But if there was time, she was curious as to which therapist you felt had met you the most. Was it modality, the person, or the context of the time you saw them?
In terms of my own therapy?
Yeah.
I only had two therapists during the time when I was in therapy, one for a very short period of time, one for a very long period of time. The therapist that I had was remarkable in ways that she was a remarkable person in ways that I couldn't quite account for. She was so different to me. And I don't think it had a lot to do with her model. She was just an extremely solid and centered and giving person. And for me, that was extremely useful. I mean, it's always important to remember, we can talk a lot about models, and models are useful. You know, they're great ways of getting certain jobs done. But there are certain qualities that we all have as people, or hopefully we have as people, that are equally important in the job that we do with our clients. You know, certain competencies that either we had before we came to be therapists, or that we develop in the course of being therapists but aren't specifically related to the training, or that we just develop in the course of our life. And I felt that she was just a particularly strikingly remarkable person. And that forced me to adjust to that, really, because I couldn't quite make sense of it. And actually the process of kind of finding her in that relationship was very powerful for me.
Thank you. Lovely. James, we're up to time. So I'm just going to say thank you very much for your time this evening. Really appreciated your answers, your thoughtfulness that have gone into both your answers this evening and into your book, and lots of food for thought for many of us here, I'm sure. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay.